Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 7 tells us there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. Ecclesiastes is a puzzle. It's a book, you read through it, and you ask yourself, why is this in the Bible? And a lot of that is just trying to figure out what is the appropriate time for everything that is in that book. When's the appropriate time to seek knowledge? When's the appropriate time for work? When's the appropriate time for pleasure? Trying to figure out when's the appropriate time for everything that is in there in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And this one line that Ecclesiastes 3:7 says is one of those times, a time to speak and a time to be silent. And perhaps one of the toughest ways of trying to apply the wisdom of God I'm not sure this will stay or not. But one of the toughest ways that we have in trying to apply the wisdom of God is trying to figure the answer to that out. When is the time to speak? When is the time to be silent? I think there are times in the Scriptures when people's silence is condemned, that they were silent in a time when they should have spoken. And I think the opposite is also true. There were times when people spoke when they should have been silent. And I think that's the struggle for all of us. I've always been known as the quiet guy. When I was a kid, I was known as the quiet kid, and now I'm just the quiet guy. And that doesn't come as a surprise to y'all who know me. I don't say a whole lot. Man, a few words. Not too long ago, I did a jury trial with a defense attorney who's a good friend of mine. And we'd never gone against each other in a jury trial before, and he was kidding me beforehand, before I did my opening statement. How are you going to communicate with the jury? You're going to use sign language? You're going to use posters? What are you going to do? But then I did my opening statement, and he seemed to be the quiet one after that. President Calvin Coolidge was a man of few words. He was nicknamed Silent Cal, and there was a time he was at a dinner one evening, and there was a lady who was sitting beside him, and she noticed that he wasn't saying a whole lot, and she leaned over to him and said, I had a friend who made a wager with me. She bet that I wouldn't be able to get you to say 3 words this whole evening. And President Coolidge just simply looked over at her and said, "You lose." I may be a child of the 80s and 90s, but I was raised on my parents' music from the 1960s. So every time we were in a car together, we always listened to that music. From the 1960s, there was a radio station out of Atlanta called Fox 97, good times and great oldies, and I grew up on that stuff. And one of those bands is an old folk rock duo. It's called Simon and Garfunkel. And you're familiar with one of the songs that they wrote called The Sound of Silence. And it is an interesting song. It's an old poem that they put to music. And it's a good song, but it's this idea. We hear the cliche, actions speak louder than words. Well, I think it's also true that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Silence can be an effective way at times to communicate. We use this in public speaking a lot. We use it when we do a closing argument. Silence. And those silent pauses can be used to your advantage to really punctuate what it is you're trying to say. And perhaps one of the seeds of godly wisdom that takes the longest to germinate and to mature is this just learning when to speak and when to remain silent. Let's think about tonight and let's examine the silence of Jesus. In the passion narratives of the Gospels, and what we mean when we say the passion narrative, this is what we're talking about, the Garden of Gethsemane through the betrayal, the arrest, the trials, the scourging, the crucifixion, all of that including the passion. The word passion, it means his suffering. And what we learn here in looking at these about the silence of Jesus, we're going to read some of these together. And through the passion narratives of Jesus, there are 4 specific moments where the Gospels highlight the silence of Jesus. And as we read these, maybe it'll give us a clue, maybe we can pick up some of those clues as to why Jesus is silent in these moments, why these are a time to remain silent. And what we can learn about silence, and also what we can learn about the use of words. When to use words wisely and when to not use words at all. Why remaining silent may at times be louder than actually opening our mouths and saying something. The first one we're going to look over at Mark chapter 14. Beginning Mark 14 and verse 55, where Jesus is before a group of Jewish leaders that is called the Sanhedrin. They form what's basically a court. Most of the Sanhedrin is made up of Pharisees and of chief priests. They would have been the influential Jewish leaders of that time, and they were supposed to be able to decide matters internally involving the Jewish law. If there was a dispute involving Jewish law, they would be brought before the Sanhedrin, and that person would basically stand trial there before the Sanhedrin. But now, at this time, they are limited in what they can do. Remember, the Romans are occupying all of Jerusalem, the area of Judea here, and they have placed certain limitations on the Jews and on the authority that the Sanhedrin has. And one of those limitations placed upon them involves the area of capital punishment. The Sanhedrin, they don't seem to be able to have the authority to execute anyone. Now, there is some debate over this issue, whether or not they actually did or not. Some point to the execution of Stephen or some other instances in the Bible where they do carry out executions without the approval of the Romans. But we always look at John chapter 18, there before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Take him, judgment according to your law." And the Jews say back to him, "It's not lawful for us to put any man to death." So we get from the text, it seems the Jews, they just don't have the authority to carry out an execution of someone. And then there are others who would argue, well, they don't have on any kind of case to do that. On some of Jewish law they're able to, but on a case such as treason or sedition where it's involving the Roman authorities, and they would have to go and get that done by the Romans. So yeah, there's a little bit of debate there. But anyway, here we are. This is the first trial Jesus is in. He's before the Sanhedrin. They're putting Jesus through this, what they're going to do with him. And let's read Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 55. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and answered nothing." The first place where we have the silence of Jesus highlighted is in the midst of this trial, which is really just a kangaroo court at this point. There are a myriad of laws and rules of procedure that the Sanhedrin is not following at this time. This is taking place at night, first of all. Something they were not supposed to do was to carry out this trial during the night. The witnesses are giving conflicting testimony. Their testimony is inconsistent. I mean, anyone who has ears that are open to truth will be able to easily pick up on the contradictions that are going on in this scene. But the problem is their ears are not open to truth. Truth is not the pursuit of this court setting. And Jesus knows that. He knows that their ears in this situation are not open to truth. Truthfulness has been denied, and when truth is not the goal of the conversation or the proceeding, then sometimes silence is your best bet. The best response. Because anything you say is going to be twisted and is going to be used against you. We all know our Miranda rights now. If you've seen any kind of cop show, every time the cops slap the cuffs on somebody and take them away and say, "You're under arrest," they always have that line. What do they say? "You're under arrest for such and such. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." So a lot of times it's in your best interest in those situations, if you ever find yourself there, to not say anything. Just remain silent. Because anything you say at that point, I am going to try and use against you at court. And a defendant, you'd say if we're in the middle of a trial, a defendant, he doesn't have to take the stand and testify on his behalf. There's no burden on him. All the burden's on us, the prosecution. He just has to sit back and watch it happen. And if he doesn't take the stand, there's nothing I can comment on about it to the jury. I can't make the argument. If he didn't do it, why didn't he just get up here and tell us he didn't do it? He just sat there and did nothing. I can't say that. So at this point, in front of the Sanhedrin, Jesus, he doesn't have the same rights, and whatever rights and privileges he may have had at this time, those seem to be denied him by the Sanhedrin. They're not following the rules and procedures of their own court. And Jesus recognizes that and decides to remain silent. The second one I want us to look at Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27, verses 11 through 14. And basically, Jesus he's going to be taken before Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor of Jerusalem. He is the one who deals out the final judicial decision of a case like this, where the Jews are asking for the death penalty. And notice the charge they present before Pilate. It's different from the charge that he seems to get found guilty of when he's with the Sanhedrin. When he's with the Sanhedrin, he's guilty of blasphemy. They come to Pilate, and they present him to Pilate under the charge of treason. Now let's read here. Matthew 27, beginning in verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. So Jesus' silence has made an impression upon Pilate. Now think about how many cases Pilate hears. These people are brought before him all the time at his judgment seat here, and he has to make decisions on them. And you can imagine all the different defenses that he hears these people make. Whether they are guilty or whether they have been falsely accused, they are probably at least going to be trying to say something in their defense, whether they are attacking the accusation or the evidence that's brought against them or the lack thereof. Or maybe they're just trying to give some type of an excuse or justification for their actions or a mitigating factor to lessen their punishment or sentence that's brought against them. And remember, this is a capital crime that Jesus is accused of committing, and what the Jews are asking for him to be put to death. If he is found guilty, he could be sentenced to death. And it's likely Pilate has seen captured Jews who were charged with treason in their fierce courage of fanaticism. But there's no fanaticism in this man. He'd also seen in many prisoners the willingness to do or say anything to escape from death. But he saw none of that with Jesus. He saw in him unusual gentleness and humility combined with majestic dignity. He beheld submission blended with innocence. And so, Pilate is amazed by the silence of Jesus. But again, you see those false accusations here. You see the falsehood that is being slung at him in this scene. It is a silence of truth in the midst of the noise of prejudice and hate. Sometimes the absolute worst response when you are insulted is to do what Romans 12 tells us not to do, to return insult for insult. And I think Jesus shows us that in this scene. Let's look at another one. Look at Luke chapter 23. We're going to look at verses 8 through 12 of Luke 23. Pilate's first response when he encounters Jesus is, he says, I'm not sure I even have jurisdiction over this man. I'm going to send him over to Herod. Herod, the tetrarch of Judea. You tell me he's a Galilean? Well, Herod just happens to be in town. I'll send him over to Herod. He has jurisdiction over that. See this a lot when courts have an issue before them they don't really want to hear. They quickly jump on something like, oh, is there an issue whether I have jurisdiction? Maybe this court over here is better. Let them take this case. I won't have to worry with it. And so here is Jesus before Herod. And this is one of the sons of Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great, the one who ordered the slaughter of the babies trying to kill Jesus when Jesus was a baby. And now one of his sons has the opportunity to preside over the case of the adult Jesus. Luke 23 and verse 8 says, "Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other." It's amazing how you can become friends with you share a common enemy. They're not sure what to do with Jesus. But Herod here, he appears to be someone who just wants to see a show. He wants to be entertained. He hasn't been longing to hear the teachings of Jesus. He hasn't trying to figure out whether or not this is a true prophet of God or the Messiah that has come. No, he wants to see a show. He wants to be entertained. I mean, do some magic tricks for me. Dance, monkey dance. Bang your cymbals, chimby. This is what I want to see. I want to be entertained. And he's, sadly, if you think about that today, some people don't want any more than that out of Jesus now. They want a show out of him, or a show at least out of his followers. And perhaps this scene here before Herod, this is part of what Jesus has in mind when he tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, don't cast your pearls before swine. I think Jesus sees this as a situation where no matter what I do here, it is not going to benefit anyone who is here. They do not have a mind that is open to the truth. They're not pursuing that. Herod's going to find this whole scene useless, so again, I think silence speaks louder than words. And the last one I want us to look over at John chapter 19, verses 4 through 9. We look at this, and then we're going to talk about some conclusions to draw and apply to our own lives. In John chapter 19, Jesus is back before Pilate, and now the final decisions are going to be made against him. And Pilate's going to give in to the crowd's demands. He's going to deliver Jesus over to be scourged and crucified. And the crowds here, they've joined in with the chief priests who are stirring them up against Jesus. They start to see him as a threat and as an enemy as well. And it's mob mentality. It's really sad how it happens. But look at this in John chapter 19, beginning in verse 4. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." And Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Now, Jesus appears to have, he's already been scourged at this point. He's already, and you know the intense and brutality, the type of punishment just the scourging entailed, and how many people did not survive even that point. He has been stripped down for the scourging. He's already been mocked at this point. And Pilate brings him out and seems to be saying, all right, look how we've already punished this evildoer. Behold the man. And then verse 6, therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So this is not enough. This scourging that has been done, it's not enough for them. Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And something about that statement, Son of God. Now, Pilate is not a Jew. He is not a believer in the one true God. But he hears this accusation. What if this person does have some type of connection to the divine? Whatever Pilate believes at this point, I don't know. He's a Roman, but he could be thinking, what if he is a son of the gods? What if he is part of this divine realm? And so he's afraid. Remember, his wife has already had a dream about Jesus. And now look at verse 9. And went again into the praetorium. He takes Jesus aside, and He's going to ask him one more question. He said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Now, if you read the whole account with Pilate and Jesus, Jesus has already given him some answers to some of the questions that he's asked. And really, I think Pilate is reaching here. He knows the answer. He knows the answer already. He just doesn't have the courage to deal with it. He doesn't have the courage to stand up for the man and actually believe he is who he says he is and take the right action in this particular situation. You know, sometimes there's no need to repeat an answer that's already been given. It's just people who don't want to accept that answer. So I want us to think now about some of the things we can learn from these 4 episodes of Jesus' silence. When is the time for us to be silent, and what other applications can we get from this? I'm going to suggest some thoughts. First of all, we have the silence of goodness in the face of orchestrated evil. This is an orchestration of evil. It's more than just people working against Jesus. We have the chief priests and the scribes and the lawyers with both the Jewish and the Roman authorities, and they are orchestrating evil against Jesus. And you know the next day when they stir up the crowds against him, that this wickedness is just inflamed by the numbers. They bring more people into this. The reason for Jesus' response, I think it's clearly spelled out in one of the books later on in the New Testament. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23. It says, "Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously." And by the way, that section of 1 Peter opens by calling us to follow in the footsteps of how Jesus handled this situation and how we're to handle ourselves when we face similar situations. Sometimes a silence of goodness, a silence of character, is going to speak louder than just trying to say the words. It's going to be the character, the silence of character, that's going to make a louder statement. You think of people who are influenced by the way Jesus handles himself at the cross and that whole situation, how he handles himself. I think of the centurion at the end of that scene when he is affected by those events. And the text doesn't say what all he's specifically affected by, but it does tell that after the events he says, "Truly, this was the Son of God." There's something about the way Jesus handles this whole scene that impacts him, the centurion, in a way that I don't think any words would have. Remember that criminal who wanted Jesus to curse those and get them off the cross. And you remember all those who were urging Jesus to say something or to talk back. And yet, he remains silent. The second thing, the silence of perception. And this is really just an extension of the goodness. Jesus perceives something in this whole situation. The silence of perception occurs when you perceive darkness that is posing as light. The twisting of truth into lies. That's really what's going on in this whole scene with Jesus. When evil justifies itself by posturing as morality, God becomes the devil and the devil becomes God. That exchange makes one impervious to reason. I think that's what's going on with the crowds in the Gospels. They have been swayed to see light that is darkness. And see light and truth and shouting out, "Crucify him, crucify him." They think they're doing the right thing. They think they're doing what's good for themselves and for their community. And this is good for all of us. And how quickly we can be deceived and blinded into seeing something that is darkness, something that gets twisted, and see it painted over with light and disguising it. And I think that's what's going on in this whole situation. If you have ever read the book The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, it's a Russian novel written in the middle of the 19th century. But it has a lot of insight throughout the whole book into humanity. It's a story of a father and his 4 sons, and the father is corrupt. And it's the story's about, the positions in life that these 4 brothers have and their relationship with their father. But one of the most memorable scenes in the book, it comes as a conversation between 2 of the brothers. One's named Ivan and the other Alyosha. And they're speaking, and Ivan, he is a skeptic. He doesn't really believe in God. But he has written a poem that he names The Grand Inquisitor. And this poem is set in the city of Seville, Spain in the 1500s. And if you know what's going on in Spain in the 1500s, then you know that this is during the time period of the Spanish Inquisition. This is when heretics are being taken out and being burned at the stake. This is the church, the Catholic Church, making these allegations against people. Anything that deviated from what they thought was right, they were taking them out, in many cases, executing them. And that's where this story is taking place that this brother Ivan has written. And the Grand Inquisitor is the name that's given to the story by Ivan. He's talking about this 89-year-old chief cardinal that's in this town of Seville. And they've been torturing and burning people that they have perceived as being heretics. And so you can see this cardinal, he's angry with everyone who he sees as a heretic. And in the midst of this treatment of the dissenters, there is a stranger that shows up in town there in Seville. And the way that he words this is, he came quietly, he came gently, and he walked through the streets in the midst of all this mess that was going on, and people were drawn to him. They were drawn to his presence. There was a gentleness about him that was different. There was a profound sense of love and compassion that was different than the environment of that city of hate and fear and isolation. And so people recognized him as someone who was special, and they started to follow him. Now, as Ivan's story goes on, it becomes clear that the character that he is talking about is none other than Jesus Christ. And it really gets us to think about whatever time you're living in, whatever place you're living in, what would happen if Jesus showed up right now? How would he react? And maybe even a better question, a more important question, how would we react to him? Would we know him when we saw him? How would we respond? How would we treat him? And the power of this story, the Grand Inquisitor, is that the 89-year-old cardinal in Seville, when he encounters him, he puts him in prison. He's afraid of him. And he comes and he visits the prisoner by night, and he's got a lantern. And I want to read to you a passage of just what this conversation goes like between this 89-year-old cardinal and this prisoner that he has. This is at night. He's come to him with a lantern. He says, "Is it you? You?" But perceiving no answer, he quickly adds, "Do not answer." Silent. "After all, what could you say? I know too well what you would say, and you have no right to add anything to what you have already said once. Why then have you come to interfere with us? For you have come to interfere with us, and you know it yourself. But do you know what will happen tomorrow? I do not know who you are, and I do not want to know whether it is you or only his likeness. But tomorrow I shall condemn you and burn you at the stake as the most evil of heretics. And the very people who today kissed your feet, tomorrow at a nod from me will rush to heap the coals up around your stake." Now this story goes on for several pages, but I think what is striking is at the end of this story. He says, "When the inquisitor fell silent, he waited some time for his prisoner to reply. His silence weighed on him. He had seen how the captive listened to him all the while intently and calmly, looking him straight in the eye and apparently not wishing to contradict anything. The old man would have liked him to say something, even something bitter, terrible. But suddenly he approaches the old man in silence and gently kisses him on his forehead. This is the whole answer. The old man shudders. Something stirs at the corners of his mouth. He walks to the door, opens it, and says to him, "Go, and do not come again. Do not come at all. Never, never." And he lets him out into the dark squares of the city. I love that story because it makes us think about would we repeat history? If Jesus was to show up, would we do the same thing to him? Would we see him as too strange? Would we see him as a threat? And would we try to spur him on to say something that we can use against him? We love to bring others down because we feel that brings us up. But we can't handle the character of Jesus, the goodness of Jesus. And I love that line, the silence of Jesus weighed down upon the inquisitor. And I think it's really a repetition of what we see going on throughout this whole, the Gospels when we read of the trials of Jesus, this whole scene in the Scriptures. The person with the greatest character that could ever walk the face of the earth. The person with the most goodness that could ever walk the face of the earth. And yet he's going to be killed as a heretic. People aren't comfortable with silence, especially from Jesus. And they often prod us into trying to get us to make a mistake with our words. They want some flaw in his speech. And I think that's what people do today. They search the Scriptures and trying to find some flaw in his speech, something they can bring against him. Why? Because his goodness is too much. We scream at Jesus, but then we want no answer that will just add to the claims that he's already made. We'd rather just ask him to leave and come no more. The goodness of his silence confronts us. A couple more things to consider. I think Jesus' silence tells us a lot about how to handle slander. When our name is slandered, when we're spoken ill of, when my reputation is attacked, when my character is attacked, what is my normal human response? I want to jump up and try to immediately, right then and there, defend myself. We have to be careful about that. I think Jesus gives us a lot of insight into how that might be a time for silence. We have a silence of composure here. Jesus is being slandered. He's being mocked. His character's being attacked. His reputation's being attacked. He's been called a liar. He's been called a blasphemer. He's been called a dissenter. All of that. And the temptation, especially knowing the evil in the hearts of the accusers, is to respond to mudslinging with mudslinging. Jesus knew some dark, dark secrets about the guys that were accusing him. It's the things that they didn't want anywhere near the light. He could have exposed all of them. He could have exposed the darkness that was in the hearts of every one of them. He knew it all. But he knew that was not going to help his case. You know, I was in court the other day. We were there on a sentencing case. A guy was being sentenced on a case that we tried, a jury trial was, and he had been found guilty on all 4 counts. And he has the opportunity to speak at his sentencing. His attorney was attempting to speak on his behalf and was doing a pretty good job, and he just wouldn't have it. He's like, "No, I'm going to speak." So he goes on and he starts speaking, and then he starts attacking me. And as a prosecutor in the case, how I forced this victim to come in and testify in this case. I told her exactly what to say. I threatened her that if she didn't show up and testify, I was going to put her in jail. That if she didn't say exactly what I told her to say, she was going to jail. And he goes on and on about all of this. And of course, I'm over there about 5 feet from it. I'm just getting angrier and angrier during the whole time as he's spouting off about me. And the judge is just up there looking at him and letting him go on and on about it. And when he finishes, he looks over at me and says, "Mr. Cochran, any of that true?" I say, "No, Your Honor." And he said, "Mr. Cochran is an officer of the court," and then proceeds to sentence the guy to a totality of 298 years in prison. But to give into temptation, to fight slander with words, in most instances, dirties both the slanderer and the one who has been slandered. Escaping from slander, therefore, is a hazardous task, and the very accusation can become valid not because of the truth, but because of the lack of composure with which one seeks to defend oneself. Jesus made no such mistake. And the last thing I think we see in the silence of Jesus is a silence of fulfilled mission. He has fulfilled his mission, and so there's nothing left to say. Isaiah 53 verse 7 tells us about Jesus, looking ahead to the suffering he was going to go through. It says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." That's highlighting the silence of Jesus. It's a silence of knowing that to finish the mission, he was going to finish it in silence. He was going to let his character speak. He was going to let the endurance of the situation speak. Jesus only speaks about 7 times on the cross. If my feeble memory serves me right, I think that's right. 7 times when he speaks. 7 short statements from Jesus while he's on the cross that are recorded in the Gospels. He reserved words for moments of significance. He didn't waste them. And one of those is to merely say, "It is finished." The finishing of the mission by entrusting himself to a righteous God. Put it in the hands of God. Sometimes just be silent and put it in the hands of God is our best response. That spoke far louder than any other testimony that Jesus could have uttered at the cross. Is there a time to speak? Absolutely. But is there also a time for silence? I think Jesus would say yes. And I think he shows us when and why and how. Let's pray. Dear God, we are thankful for your wisdom. We ask that as we face moments in our life that are tempting sometimes to just get up and want to speak as loudly and as forcefully sometimes as we can. But we understand, Father, that sometimes it's better to not say anything at all. We ask that you will help us with that, with this difficulty that you have presented us with, trying to figure out when is the time to speak and when is the time to be quiet. Help us to have the wisdom to make those choices, to make the correct choices. Father, we thank you and we love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.